Good afternoon and welcome to the Boise Metro Chamber's Congressional Forum featuring Senator Mike Crapo. I am Charlene Marr, President and CEO of Blue Cross of Idaho and Chair of the Boise Metro Chamber of Commerce. This is the Chamber's second virtual Congressional Forum this year. Before we hear from Senator Crapo, I would like to thank our sponsors for this event. Our presenting sponsor today is Blue Cross of Idaho. Our sponsor is Bank of Idaho and Intermountain Gas Company. Our co-sponsor is St. Luke's Health System. And finally, our contributing sponsors are Boise State University, WaFd Bank, Idaho Housing and Finance Association, Micron Technology, St. Alphonsus Health System, and United Heritage Insurance. Thank you, sponsors, for your continued support. Over this last year, I have to take a moment to say how proud I am of the work the Chamber has done. Without missing a beat, they continue to support our businesses across our community. And these are unprecedented times, and there have been unprecedented challenges. I want to thank you all for your continued support. I would now like to hand it over to Matt Erpelding, Vice President, Government and Community Relations, who will introduce Senator Mike Crapo and lead the discussion. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Charlene. And welcome everyone to our last Congressional Forum, of the year. We are so lucky today to have Senator Mike Crapo with us. But before I introduce Senator Crapo, I just want to thank Blue Cross of Idaho and in particular Charlene for her commitment as chair of the board this year during 2020, such a difficult year. Blue Cross of Idaho is our premier sponsor for this event, and in order to showcase their commitment, we have a very brief video to show you.
Oh, when I'm on the road, bound for home, back to what I know, back to Idaho, Idaho.
Senator Crapo was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1998 after serving 6 years in the U.S. House of Representatives and 8 years in the Idaho State Senate, where he served as Senate President Pro Tem. Senator Crapo, the senior United States Senator for Idaho, was elected to the Senate in 1998 and is currently serving his 4th term as our senator. He became a member of the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee at the beginning of his service in 1999 and became chairman of the committee at the onset of the 115th Congress in 2017. Senator Crapo is the second-ranking Republican on the Senate Finance Committee that oversees a wide range of federal policy, including the federal tax code, revenue generation, foreign trade, and social and healthcare services program. He also serves on the Senate Committee on the Judiciary, is a senior member of the Budget Committee, and serves as a member of the Joint Committee on Taxation. His sensible approach has earned him respect of his colleagues, and he has been selected to serve in various other leadership roles in the 116th Congress, including as Chief Deputy Republican Whip. Senator Crapo, it's such an honor to have you with us today. How are you doing in Washington? I know you're busy, and I appreciate you taking time out of your day.
Well, we are very busy here, and I'll mention that maybe when you give me a chance to do some opening remarks. But it's an interesting time here, just like I think everyone is having that kind of a time. I have most of my staff working remotely. Occasionally, one or two of them have to come in order to take care of me. But you know, the reality is that we've been able to get along pretty well with that. And I think, like most people in America, we're learning a new way of doing business.
Well, we're excited to hear from you. And so with that, I'll be back after your remarks. But sir, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And again, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Charlene, and to everyone who is on this call. I really appreciate the chance to communicate with you. Like I just mentioned, we've learned a new way of doing business, and until we get through this pandemic, I think we will all end up being doing business this way for a long time. I hope that time is shorter than it looks like it could be right now, but we are battling our way through it. And I guess the first thing I would say is that I'm really excited to see that we have now 1 and soon 2 vaccines becoming available. I think Idaho is getting its first set of vaccines, as are all of the other 50 states this week, the Pfizer vaccines. And we should see thousands of Idahoans getting the opportunity, with our healthcare providers being the ones first able to have those vaccines. That is going to be a big boost, I think, in our efforts to try to defeat this pandemic and this virus. But let me just kind of make my introductory remark as short as I can. It's hard for it to not filibuster, but I like the question and answer series part of these meetings best. Let me just talk about what's happening here in the Senate and in the Congress as we are meeting here today. There is a significant amount of remaining business to be done. It focuses on what has become, unfortunately, an annual thing, and that is trying to finish up the appropriations process so we don't have a government shutdown. We look like we're getting very close to that year-end omnibus bill. I hope that we can get into the process of doing each of the appropriations bills separately and not get into these year-end crises. But it does look like we are getting close to wrapping up that year-end omnibus bill. That bill will probably become a bigger package, meaning there will be things other than just the appropriations that we get some conclusion on and work into the bill for the final actions of the Congress, which may be this week. I'm talking about things like tax extenders for those focused on our tax policy. We get into a lurch and stop process with regard to our tax extenders, just like we do with regard to our spending. And we may have a tax extender bill that can go along with the omnibus spending bill. We also have talked a lot about some of the healthcare reforms that we've been unable to get over the line so far. And one of them is surprise billings. We may be coming close to the point where we have an agreement that can work across party lines and across the rotunda here in the Congress to have some major legislation to help individuals, the insured individuals, stop facing surprise billings when they have expensive bills at the hospital that were not specifically covered by their insurance. This is becoming a bigger and bigger problem across the country, but that also looks like we may be able to get a solution to it as we move forward in the last days of this Congress. We also have the wrap up of our National Defense Authorization Act. This is the key legislation that has been done every year for the last 60 years to update and strengthen and reauthorize all of our national defense activities. This is a critically important bill for our national security, and we have that legislation to move forward as well. And we've made very good progress on getting that done. And then 2 other things. One is nominations. As I think everyone knows, this Congress and the previous Congress have focused very extensively on nominations, particularly of the judiciary, and that will continue until the very last days of the Congress. And finally, COVID legislation. We are all scurrying to try to make sure that we leave no stone unturned in our efforts to get an agreement on the next legislation to deal with the coronavirus. I have high hopes that we can get there. I actually believe if I had to place a bet, I would say we will get something before the end of the year rather than having to punt this issue into the next Congress. It's very difficult. We are in very different places, and maybe you'll like to ask a question about that and I can get into more detail on it. But if we do get an agreement on a COVID bill, we will try to wrap that into the final spending package as well. So there's a lot of activity underway here, many other things that I haven't mentioned in terms of legislation that is trying to be finalized and agreed to so it can become a part of this final very big package. And you could see an extremely large package move within the next week, possibly. With that, Matt, let me stop and let's jump into your questions.
There we go. That sounds great, Senator Crapo. Let's build on a little bit of the conversation around extending PPP. This year has been extraordinarily difficult on our economy, but the root cause is the pandemic. Can you go into depth a little bit more about where the negotiations are at between the president, between the Senate, and the House on not just providing additional economic relief to individuals, but what changes are you all looking at making with regard to the PPP loan program?
A very critical part of the CARES Act was the PPP program. I was instrumental because of my chairmanship of the Banking Committee in putting that program together, along with the Federal Reserve 13.3 facilities, which are now being wound backward because they've performed their purpose. With the PPP program, it was very successful. In fact, it was an incredible example of putting an absolutely brand new, very large federal program together and implementing it in a matter of weeks. Usually they take a matter of years to put together and get operational. And it was able to get hundreds of billions of dollars into our private sector, particularly our smaller companies, at a time when the COVID crisis and the restrictions the government was imposing were devastating our small businesses across this country. We learned, however, that as successful as that program was, that there were areas that needed to be improved. For one thing, I can tell you, I fully expect in the next package, which I think will come this month, that we will extend the PPP program, put hundreds more of billions of dollars into it, and also expand and improve it. We will extend deadlines for a number of the spending of the loan money. We will provide a significantly enhanced ability for companies who took out loans under $150,000 to be able to get those loans forgiven without a lot of bureaucratic difficulty. We will expand the types of entities, I believe, who participate in those loans. I know that the Chamber is very interested in 501c6 organizations being able to qualify for those loans. And I expect that that will be included in the legislation. And we are going to extend the scope of what the loans can be used for. The purpose of the loans was limited very strictly to wages and salaries, with some other types of expenses being allowed as well. But we're going to expand and allow companies to be a little more flexible in how they proceed. It will still focus on trying to make sure that we maintain employment and keep individuals employed rather than seeing them either go on unemployment or simply be furloughed. There are a number of other pieces of it as well. I think I'll use your question to jump a little bit further too. There are some industries for whom the PPP loan doesn't work that well, and instead they need direct support and assistance that is either in the form of a grant or of direct loans outside the PPP program, or some type of tax credit or other type of assistance. And we are working on trying to get those types of programs authorized as well. It's a little more difficult in that zone because there are, like I said, a number of different industries, and it's very difficult for Congress to fine tune those kinds of programs by industry. And so we're looking at ways to try to address that.
So let's build on that, because that's a question that a lot of our members have, and that is, will the PPP or the new stimulus roll something in like the Restaurants Act, which has been really important, particularly to independent restaurants that maybe couldn't access the PPP loans in a way that was enough to keep them afloat? And so the Restaurants Act is designed to be some of that grant distribution for restaurants that have taken a 50 or 60 or 70% revenue loss. Do you see that moving forward in this package?
The answer is partially. There are some of the improvements that we are making to the PPP program that will make it more workable for restaurants and frankly, broader into the hospitality industry. However, I have to say that when I mentioned that it was harder to figure out these solutions on an industry by industry basis, as you know, and as I think your question contemplates, there's actually a Restaurants Act. And as you might guess, there are also specific proposals across a number of other industries that range everywhere from the cruise lines to the airlines to hotels and motels and many and places that put on shows and so forth. There are just a number of different types of industries that are impacted, and we are having difficulty getting the details of those kinds of responses worked out. Secretary Mnuchin, who I work with very closely on these matters, has indicated that he believes that some of these industries need direct grants rather than forgivable loans like the PPP program, or that they need, in addition to that, to have changes in the tax code that will deal with tax credits and so forth, like the Restaurants Act does propose. I support the Restaurants Act, but what I'm saying is I'm not highly confident that a specific act like that will make it into the next package. We are working to try to get that done, and for all of the restaurant owners and the other hospitality and hotel industry folks who may be listening, we are working to try to get that included. But it's becoming more problematic to get the kind of agreement that we need to have at this point in time to get specific packages for industry by industry included in the act. So we are making progress in some areas, and I believe a partial solution will be included in the act, but the final answer may be, unfortunately, something that has to be held over to the next Congress. And I don't mean late in the next Congress. I expect that we will be moving very quickly in the next Congress into looking at what needs to be done that we couldn't get done in this bill. What we are finding as we put together this bill for the wrap up of this Congress, that pretty much only those items that have bipartisan support and bicameral support can make it into this particular package. And any that need further refinement or any that have conflict surrounding them still will not make it into the package, but it doesn't mean that we will stop working on trying to resolve those.
Well, so that answers my next question, which has been, it seems like there's a real sticking point between the Senate, which is advocating for some liability protections for businesses, and the House, which is advocating for additional resources to state and local governments. Do you see those being left out of this legislation in order to get something accomplished and then picked up after the new Congress comes back?
Yes, Matt, I think that's exactly what probably will happen. Obviously, nothing has been finalized yet, but the biggest problems we've been facing in putting the details together have arisen in those two areas. On the one hand, the demand coming from the Republicans in the Senate that we deal with liability reform, and on the other hand, that coming mostly from the House, that we deal with their demand. The House is asking for $500 billion for state and local support. And maybe I should just explain a little bit about why the conflict there, because I believe in the end what's going to happen is both of those will off, because as I said, they are not ready for prime time in the sense of being ironed out yet, and we will move forward with those areas that we can iron out, which are significant. There are major areas, and we will see major legislation if we get it done this week. But why is there this big conflict? Well, the Republicans, as you indicated, particularly from the Senate, well, the House Republicans as well, although they're in the minority in the House, believe that the next major pandemic, if you will, could be litigation. And not just against businesses, against hospitals, healthcare providers, schools, universities, nursing homes, all kinds of care centers, everywhere that people are either being cared for or even in places of entertainment or restaurants, as we just mentioned. And the question is, because there will be harm coming to people if they contact or contract the virus, can claims for the damage of that harm be made against some entity or some individual? And we can see there are thousands of types of claims like that already being filed. And so the Republicans, and I want to make this clear, the Republicans are not saying there should be blanket liability protection. In other words, not just a ban on any litigation, but that those individuals or entities, our universities, schools, hospitals, healthcare providers, et cetera, and our small businesses that have followed reasonable procedures should be able to have a safe harbor for having done that. And it's kind of difficult to put that together because the procedures and what's reasonable have kind of developed over time. And we're trying to put together a system, though, where someone who's engaged in gross negligence or willful violation of rules or standards will not be relieved of liability. But those who have tried to follow this can be relieved of liability. On the state and local side, and there's an objection to that. There are those who are supported by the trial lawyer community who say, no, we need to allow litigation to continue as it would ordinarily have continued for injuries in different locales. And we're just having a conflict over that. The conflict over the state and local funding relates not to the need to provide support for state and local. You'll remember we put about $1 trillion into state and local support in the first CARES Act. And by the way, most of that money has not already been spent. There are still quite a bit there to spend out. But the concern that has arisen there is that there are a number of states over the years that have gotten into fiscal problems way before COVID. And it was because of simple fiscal irresponsibility in those states that had many of them, or a number of them, looking at the possibility of facing bankruptcy. And the question had been raised before COVID as to whether the federal government would step in and bail out these states and make everybody else in the other states pay for their fiscal irresponsibility. And the effort is to make sure that the money given in any kind of state and local package does not go to bail out fiscal irresponsibility and is instead help to pay for COVID-related damage to the state budgets. And we are trying to work that out as well. And we just have not been able to work out those two issues yet.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And so do you see, and this is just a really quick follow-up on that, do you see some of the trillions of dollars that has gone to local government, which has a deadline of the end of the year, do you see that being extended for some of the states that receive that money and haven't spent it? Or is that deadline probably hard and fast in this legislation?
No, actually, it's always dangerous to predict anything in this kind of a climate, but I'm going to do that. I'm going to say I do believe we will have an extension. So that those monies can be spent. And because right now the states, because they're worried about that, are starting to spend it out really fast.
Right.
And we really want that. We want the states to spend it wisely and to shepherd that money carefully. So I believe there will be an extension in whatever agreement we do reach. And I guess I'm also saying that I'm feeling quite hopeful that we will reach an agreement of some sort, even though it will be a smaller package than many would prefer it be. It'll still be a big.
Yeah, your Senate seniority is really important to a small state like Idaho. And you are in line to be the possible next chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. Could you give our viewers a little bit of an overview of what the Senate Finance Committee does and what agenda items you would have for the next Congress if you were to become the chairman of that committee?
Yeah, and actually, I appreciate that question. I personally believe, and I think there wouldn't be a lot of disagreement about this on the Hill, I believe the Finance Committee is potentially the most powerful committee in the entire Congress. And the reason I say that is because of the breadth of its jurisdiction. The jurisdiction of the Finance Committee can be roughly broken into three broad areas, but there are many other pieces to it. The first is revenue, the tax code, and all tax policy. And I think everybody knows how incredibly important tax policy is, but that is the entire revenue arm of the federal government. And it's not just the Internal Revenue Code, but it's all of the revenue generating, like tariffs and all the policies related to that bring money into the government. And any bill that has anything to do with the tax code, and as you might guess, that's a lot of the legislation that runs through the Senate, has to be dealt with in the Finance Committee. The second thing is it has jurisdiction over virtually all of the entitlements, not every single one. For example, we don't have the Farm Bill, and there are some entitlements in the Farm Bill, but we have the healthcare related entitlements, and that's about 95% of all the entitlement spending of the federal government, and that's about 60% of all the spending in the federal government. So this committee has almost, if not entirely, all the revenue side of our government and about 60% of the spending side of our government. Third, it has jurisdiction over international trade. I mentioned the tariffs, but it's literally the trade agreements. And whether that is the TPP that was being negotiated a few years ago, in which I wish we had entered and finalized, or whether it's the USMCA between the US, Mexico, and Canada, or whether it's the China-US trade negotiations or the European Union trade negotiations or what have you, that also runs through this committee. And so this committee has just a very broad reach. Your question also was, what would my agenda be moving forward? It would be focused in those three areas. In the tax arena, there is always a tremendous amount of tax policy. I mentioned the tax extenders. That's a major part of our tax policy that has to be adjusted each year. Everybody who's in business, who's listening to this, knows that the tax extenders need to be fixed, and we need to resolve our system of handling them. The tax reforms that we made a few years ago were some of the most important things that I've been working on for the last 10 or 15 years. This came out of the Bowles-Simpson Commission, some of you may recall, when we put forward a plan for stabilizing and strengthening our fiscal policy here in the United States. And we finally got tax reform put into place that would make our country competitive again globally. And we stopped seeing capital flow out of the United States, capital formation, and started seeing capital formation come back to the United States again. Companies stopped fleeing the United States because of our tax policy. They started forming here and staying here because of our tax policy. And so one of my agendas will be to strengthen and actually improve on the tax reform we achieved a couple of years ago. And there will be a number of other tax-related priorities. In the healthcare arena, the list is very broad. I've got major legislation to deal with our prescription drug pricing in the United States. We are going to be working on multiple pieces of our Medicare and Medicaid system, our CHIPS system, the remainder of Obamacare that is left, and the provisions that we are going to be dealing with in terms of trying to reform our healthcare system and keep it focused on improving a private sector focus rather than socializing our healthcare system. And then, of course, on trade, the committee will be very focused in often helping to negotiate and always helping to oversee, and finally, if agreements are reached, to approve of the trade agreements that are going to be moving forward. So we'll have a pretty full agenda.
That is a full agenda. There's a question that was submitted by our viewers that involves rail, and you've long supported the idea of using rail as an economic investment tool for Idaho. And the question really is, what are you doing right now to help advance rail development in Idaho, and what can our communities do to help you in that?
Well, I appreciate that question, by the way, as you indicate by the question. The short line rail community is critical to Idaho's our agriculture, our transportation system. What we mean when we say short line rail is it's those rail lines that have often been divested by bigger railroads as they consolidated operations. But it's those rail lines, and there are hundreds of them around the country, that take the shipments, the freight, from the interior, interior parts of Idaho, to the major rail lines. And it's how we get goods and services to and from the major rail transportation systems. It's literally like arteries running to the heart, if you will, and they are critical to our economy. And they have a credit in the tax code. Once again, back to the tax code, and this is in the Finance Committee. They have a credit in the tax code to help them continue to upgrade and build out their infrastructure so that they have strong, solid operational rail systems. And we have been able to get broad bipartisan support for this upgrade in both the Senate and the House. We have legislation. I'm the Republican lead on it. And that legislation, probably Senator Wyden, by the way, my colleague who's also the highest ranking member on the Democrat side of the Finance Committee, is my Democrat colleague on that legislation. We've got, I think, 70 senators co-sponsoring our bill, somewhere in that range. And in the House, similarly, way more than half of the House members are co-sponsoring the House version. It is one of those things I referenced earlier as a tax extender. This credit expires every so often, and it has to be extended or it goes away, and we need to make it permanent. That's what our bill does. We are literally in the process of the negotiations on the tax extenders that are underway right now. We are working to get that tax credit made permanent so that it's a permanent part of the code and we don't have to lurch and stop as we move forward with our tax policy. We are running into a little bit of difficulty getting final agreement between the House and the Senate on the exact details of that. And so right now, I would encourage everyone in Idaho who's a part of that industry or who is interested in that issue to write letters and encourage all of their colleagues across the country to contact their senators and their House members to tell them to push hard for this. Literally right now, within the next day or so, we will resolve this one way or the other, and we need to resolve it soon and favorably.
You know, yesterday the Electoral College voted to select Joe Biden as president-elect, and this morning Senator McConnell acknowledged the president-elect Biden as the incoming president. And you have a long history with President-elect Biden, as he was a former senator who you had the opportunity to serve with. And as we look at divided government going into January 20th, how can you utilize that relationship with him? And what do you think we can accomplish over the next 6 months as the Biden administration comes in and we have a Republican Senate, most likely a Republican Senate, and a Democratic House and a Democratic governor?
Well, yes, Matt, you're correct. The Electoral College did certify Joe Biden as the president-elect. And and you indicated that the Senate was probably going to be Republican. We're all on pins and needles about the races in Georgia. But assuming that the Republicans are able to win those races, then I will be able to be the chairman of the Finance Committee and in that capacity work with the Biden administration. I've known Joe Biden for years. I've served with him in the Senate, and he and I are very good personal friends. I fully expect that he and I can work closely together on matters. You may recall it was Joe Biden, when he was vice president, who negotiated the Budget Control Act with Mitch McConnell, putting together a strong bipartisan compromise that helped us to get a stronger handle on our fiscal policy. And so I'm very hopeful about being able to work with a President Biden in the next administration, if that's the way it turns out. If the one concern I have, and your question raises one question, and that is, as candidate Biden for president, Joe Biden advocated a number of things that I don't support. For example, the expansion of our healthcare system more toward a socialized medicine system rather than trying to reform and focus on the private sector strengths of our system. A number of other things that in the tax code, he talked about undoing the tax policy that we did in the 2 or 3 years ago. I don't know whether he will pursue those agendas as president, or whether that was, or whether those were positions that he was pushed into talking about as he was trying to obtain the nomination in the Democratic primaries for the presidency. If he does try to unwind our tax policy or to move our healthcare policy toward a more socialist type of healthcare, I will have to object and try to work against that. But even in that context, I will try to work with him to instead find better solutions. And I feel very hopeful about that possibility.
You know, that's a really great pivot to a concern that I think many of us have expressed that have spent some time in politics, and certainly I've not been involved in it as long as you have, but the undercurrents in our society right now are a little bit frightening. Democrats and Republicans together have objectified one another's views. We've weaponized the views, and in doing so, we've created a tinderbox in terms of how we speak to one another. How do you look at what can we do to fix some of the incivilities that are really becoming prevalent in our government and the damage that it's doing?
That is a very critical question, Matt, and it's one that in one way or another I've asked myself or other people have asked me for quite a while now. You are right. The one way that I've described it is that character assassination and, well, just that character assassination has become the political weapon of the day. Rather than attacking someone or disagreeing with their ideas and talking with them about what you believe are better ideas, the mode of conduct in politics seems to have migrated toward personal attack and character assassination. Don't attack or discuss the ideas, but attack the person and try to make that person less credible. We need to move away from that. By saying that I'm concerned about that, though, I don't want to overlook the fact or create the mischaracterization that everything is that way. But that's the kind of thing that gets reported. Particularly, a story about character assassination or a fight is much more likely to get into the news than a story about the cooperation that people are engaging in. And I could go through a list, for example, of things that I've built on a bipartisan basis, everything from the Owyhee Initiative to the wildfire fix on fire borrowing. The list goes on and on. The SRS funding for our schools, those kinds of things were bipartisan accomplishments in the midst of this rather acrimonious climate back here. So it can be done. And I'm not the only one working on that. A lot of my colleagues work very hard. I'd say far more, the largest majority work very hard on both sides of the aisle to try to keep it civil and to try to find compromise where we can, without giving up each other's principles, find good solutions. And that's what we need to do. And we all need to work harder at that here in Congress. But I want to say, I think that part of our problem really comes from the fact that we aren't the only ones, and even our constituents aren't the only ones who are engaged in this process. The way our campaign finance system works right now, most of the money doesn't come through candidates raising money for their campaigns. It comes from other sources, from what sometimes is called dark money, but it's money that is not regulated in terms of how it can be raised. And the ads that are run, which by the way are mostly attack ads, don't even have to specifically identify where the money for those ads came from. And it doesn't even have to identify an actual entity. I mean, it has to say this ad was run by the Association to Make America Better, but it doesn't say who that is. And what we're seeing is that this kind of money is so prevalent in politics that it drives conflict all by itself. And that conflict is almost unavoidable if the people who are listening to those ads believe in them. And so I just encourage people to kind of take the political advertising that you see with a grain of salt and look deeper into the character of the men and women who are putting themselves on the line in a campaign, and try to figure out what their real heart is, rather than letting some of the attack ads be successful. I think if members of the Congress could believe that the attack ads would not be listened to so much by their constituents, they might be able to be even more willing to make concessions and to build solutions, rather than always being cautious about appearing to talking to the enemy. I don't know if I'm making it clear here, but I really think that as people talk to me, I'd say 90% of the people who talk to me about this issue say we're tired of all the obstruction and all of the partisanship that's going on in Congress. And I just hope that they will also be tired of the attack ads that are going on and all of that conflict that is being driven in the media about what's going on here, and maybe cut a little bit of slack to their senators and congressmen in the context of trying to find out more about what they really believe and what they really are doing, rather than letting this dark money drive the nature of the conversation.
Yeah, it's a real challenge when we forget that we're all humans and that our values really help define who we are, and the amount of, whether it's dark money or negativity that is in our politics right now. It's important that we remember that politics is really a noble profession. It's a difficult profession, and give some credit there. You know, Senator Crapo, we're so honored to have you today. I also know you have a hard stop at 1:15 because you got to get back to the PPP program and all the other stuff you're working on. So I want to thank you so much for joining us. And I want to thank your staff, Bob, Kelly, Katie, Amanda, all of them were just incredible to work with. And you've got a great group of people around you. And we really appreciate you. And before I cut out, I also want to thank our sponsors. The Chamber really had to make a lot of pivots this year in order to make virtual events happen. And if it wasn't for Blue Cross of Idaho, Intermountain Gas, Bank of Idaho, St. Luke's, and Norco, and many, many other sponsors over the last year, we would have been in a much different place. And so thank you so much, Senator Crapo. We appreciate you. Good luck. Make that deal happen. And have a very Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays.
Thank you. And by the way, before you close it off, Matt, I want to thank you for the shout out you gave to my staff. I got the best staff in Congress, and they deserve that shout out. So thank you for that. And thank you to everybody for being with us today.
Absolutely. Have a great day, everybody.